The category is What the Trans, darling?
Hello, 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 and welcome to What the Trans.
What the Trans? Now we're weekly.
We are, yes, we have decided to do that. We've thought shorter and more frequent, and that would be for a number of reasons, which, you know, let's not spend ages discussing because we've got limited time now. We just thought would be better.
Yeah, we'll actually now have to think before we speak and choose our words carefully.
I don't think I like this. No. Yes, so we're trying that out. Hopefully you'll come along with us and we will still, you know, provide you with all of that lovely Ashleigh and Michelle hijinks that you've all come to know and tolerate. How are you?
I'm alright. I've started watching professional video game players play video games, which is something I never thought I would do.
Right, fair dues. Are they good at it?
I mean, they're incredible at it. My favourite team is the London Spitfires. They are an Overwatch team.
Are they from London?
Everyone on the team is from South Korea. And I have read in several places that not only are they all South Korean, they've never actually been to London. Like, if they were all South Korean and lived in London, it would make some kind of sense.
A little bit.
But it's online. I think it was an arbitrary name thought up. And to be fair, I support them because they have London in the name, and I live there. So, you know, I'm going along with it.
I mean, that's as good a reason as any. So, in this particular episode, as the name suggests, it is Manifesto Mayhem. We have an election on in the UK. It's our third one in how many years now?
2015, 2017, 2019.
Yeah, right.
In the space where we should have had one, we've had three.
Yes, good stuff. And obviously that means that we've had several prime ministers as well, although all of them represented the same party. So what we're going to be doing is, or what we have done more accurately, is we have been trawling through the manifestos of each of the major political parties, so you don't have to. There is a lot of stuff that people are talking about with regards to this election. Some people are saying it's a single issue election about Brexit, and there's kind of some truth to that. But then there's also some people saying that it's actually far more than that, and it's genuinely is about the future of the country and the direction that would take, and in what way we should do that, and all that other stuff. And there's some truth to that as well. Unfortunately, this stuff is complicated and difficult and kind of overwhelming. And to an extent, I suspect there are at least some who are relying on the public being overwhelmed by it all and thinking, oh, well, I don't care about it, I'm not going to vote. But you should vote. And what we're going to try and do is give you a bit of information, a bit of context about each of the parties. Starting with our chums in red. Now, Michelle, you did a bit of an interview for this one, didn't you?
Yes, I sat down and had a nice chat with a couple of the co-chairs from LGBT Labour to try and get their take on the Labour manifesto. I spoke to Lewis Adlington-Lee and Heather Peto. Very, very lovely people. Very, very nice to talk to them. And we will be hearing from them very shortly. But for now, let's go through the Labour manifesto. Now, the approach I took to this was, I assumed that if you want to know about housing or transport, you would be able to get that in other places. I decided to focus on stuff that is, I believe, the most important issues for trans and non-binary people specifically. So if you want to know about the transport policy of the Labour Party, I'm afraid you're going to have to go somewhere else because I'm no expert on transport policy. But as a trans woman who's been covering the trans news beat for the last 4 years off and on, this is my area. So I'm going to concentrate on the area that I know.
Yep. See, this is us staying in our lane. Anyway, carry on.
Yes, this is us staying in our lane. I mean, there will be references to other policies going through, but mostly going to be focusing on the trans stuff. Starting off with the big one that has been making the rounds on all the social medias in that the Labour manifesto included in its women's section the following sentence, that they will ensure that the single-sex-based exemptions contained in the Equality Act of 2010 are understood and fully enforced in service provision. Now, this is a strange thing to include because on the surface it appears to look like they are just going to let the Equality Act stand as it currently stands. But as people who are trans and non-binary may well be aware, this is this could be seen as something as a dog whistle to certain nightmarish turf anti-trans groups out there who seem to believe that the single-sex based exemptions in the Equality Act are reasons to basically say no trans people, which they are not.
Indeed, as we discussed at length on previous episodes, and particularly with Diana James. So,
yes, the way the exemption is supposed to work, according to Diana James and many other people that we've talked to over the life of this podcast, is that there needs to be a legitimate purpose to use these exemptions. You can't just say the purpose is we don't like trans people or we don't believe trans people are who they say they are. It has to be...
The way it's phrased in the Act is it's got to be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. So keeping out trans women because they are trans is not a legitimate aim, and so any action taken to do that would not, therefore, be considered proportional.
So this obviously caused a bit of a stir in the trans community, and people saw that, in spite of the fact that the Labour manifesto does say that they will work to reform the Gender Recognition Act and introduce self-ID, and I will get into that phrasing of working to in a moment. But a lot of trans people and non-binary people were like, what the shit, Labour? Are you capitulating to the TERFs in your party now? Is that what's happening? So Dawn Butler then released a response on Twitter saying that Labour will reform the GRA to introduce self-declaration for trans people. We will remove outdated language from the Equalities Act, and there is no way spaces will be permitted to discriminate against trans people. That is illegal, and it will stay illegal. So that is what was meant, but then the inclusion of it was, quite frankly, a pretty fucking bizarre. She also tweeted out that reform of the Gender Recognition Act does not affect access to single-sex services and facilities. Labour has a proud record of protecting and progressing women's rights, and we ensure the Equality Act of 2010 included exemptions for the provision of separate and single-sex services, provided that such treatment is justified as, here's that phrase again, a proportionate response to achieving a legitimate aim. Labour recognises the importance of this provision. We would seek to ensure that the government provides comprehensive guidance and ensures providers have robust safeguarding policies in place to ensure the safety of all women. Now, she tweeted that out in the form of a letter she sent to former Women and Equalities Secretary of State, Penny Mordaunt, in 2018.
Yes, there's something about that date that's... yes, that's right, it was fucking ages ago and nothing's happened since.
Yes. According to LGBT Labour and a few other people from the Labour Party, this is the policy that Labour has, and the inclusion of that phrasing did not come with this additional context. I mean, it's still pretty troubling that it got in there in the first place, but there has been some clarification, so I don't necessarily believe this means that the Labour Party are going to turn around and be like, right, that's it, trans people. We lured you in. Now we're going to screw you. I don't think that's Labour's game here. But, I mean, based on the stuff that they've come out with yet. But again, don't entirely know. But moving on to other parts of the manifesto.
Yes.
Self-ID, they are working towards... They will work towards bringing into a thing, but this was not in the same way, in the same section as their pledges. The pledges I'm reading as promises. This was put in like the paragraph before the promises saying, we will work to getting self-ID, which is not the same thing as saying we will do self-ID.
Yeah.
It's basically them saying, we're going to try. And that, I think, I would love a promise on that, but, you know...
I mean, at this point, they've got an election to win. They've got... It's not just trans people who are going to be voting for Labour. Jesus, I hope. I hope that pretty much everybody votes for them and kicks the Tories out. But then that's me getting personal.
Yeah, I don't think it's any secret that me and you are almost definitely going to be voting for Labour in this general election.
And I would point out that I will do that with a heavy heart, but priorities. So the thing... There was... something else that Dawn Butler said, which is that the government should begin a consultation on the need to create a legal category for non-binary people. And it's like, okay, so I am with you in terms of legal recognition for non-binary people. I'm not sure a whole other category is necessary to do that. I just think that's something that could be done within the infrastructure of how things are measured and what things that are filled in on forms and whatever else. But then again, the suggestion that should be something that has a consultation behind it. And I remind you of the phrase that the rights of the minority should never be subordinated to the whims of the majority. And that is what a consultation does every time. It is basically saying, members of the public, tell us about this thing, whether it affects you or not. And obviously people who are, providing kind of anti-trans, anti-non-binary sentiments within that may or may not be taken on board and taken seriously in the ultimate results. But the fact is, by running a consultation, you're essentially sending a message to that community where it's like, oh, well, yeah, we'd love to help you, but we don't know if it's democratically viable. So, you know,
yeah,
nothing is perfect. Nobody is perfect. This world is hellish, but maybe we have a chance I think we definitely have a chance for the lesser of several evils, and I think this might be it. Anyway, so the rest of the manifesto did have some quite hopeful stuff in it, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the non-binary thing, non-binary people never got a mention in any part of the manifesto specifically. That just did not happen. And something that may be troubling to some non-binary people out there who are listening is Labour plans to end mixed sex wards, which, yeah, that could cause a problem.
Like, why would they do that? Why would they specifically make a point of saying, oh, yes, this is bad, you know? Oh, okay, that seems a bit of an odd hill to die on, you know? Sure, someone fought hard for that to be included, and I do have to wonder why.
I think that there may be some cases where, like, single-sex wards should probably be a thing.
Yes.
Like, in some very specific circumstances. But then, even in that case, like, I mean, I have been an inpatient before, and I have been taken to a separate room away from everyone else as a trans woman, and in some respects it was great because I got my own room, but in other respects it's like, oh, okay.
Thanks.
Okay, this doesn't feel great. But anyway, that was something that came up and was genuinely a little bit shocking to me. But also, they want to increase healthcare spending by 4.3% per year. They promise to make health services accessible to BAME, LGBT and disabled patients. They want to invest more in mental health, which is always good because mental health in the UK right now sucks. And the trans community is in dire need of mental health services because we are far more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety and all the other horrible mind horrors than most other people on the basis of being trans in the world. And people always wanting to tell us what they think of that.
Helpful. Thanks, guys. Very helpful. I think a key part of Labour's whole election thing and part of their manifesto is essentially to save and preserve the NHS. You know, and I think we're definitely going to have to talk about a couple of the other parties and their opinion on the NHS.
Yeah, and I do want to say that whilst me and Ashleigh are going to be open and honest about where we're probably going to end up with our votes, we're going to be trying and doing this so we're not promoting any one party over the others. The only line we've drawn, like we said last time, is fuck the Tories. The Tories are evil. The Tories are bad. And we will get into specifically why later on in the show. But when it comes to Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, whatever, like, it's up to you to decide which flavour is your personal one. But I think it's probably right that we be honest and say where we stand. So you could take that into account if you think we're being unfair to your party. But anyway, moving on, they want to fully fund PrEP and sexual health services, obviously for trans women and a bunch of trans men and non-binary people. In fact, the whole trans community, PrEP and sexual health services are incredibly important, so that is promising. One thing that stuck out that I thought would really affect pretty much everyone in the trans community is abolishing prescription charges, which, I mean, I'm pretty sure the vast majority of trans people have a prescription for some kind of hormone thing. Obviously, there are people that don't, and they choose not to, or they can't, and they are perfectly valid in themselves. But I think this is a specific issue that is a very, very small quality of life change that could really affect vast swathes of the community. So I'm down with that.
Absolutely.
Now we're getting onto the things that they did not mention. They did not mention tackling the rise in hate crimes against trans people, or indeed any minority. They did reference fighting hate crimes, but nothing concrete in tackling rising hate crimes, if you see what I mean. They did not address or refer to non-binary people directly at any point. They did not say anything about transgender children, really, or anything about lowering the age of self-ID if it is to become a thing to 16 or whatever. And there was no mention of specific trans medical treatment, but this is the thing with the healthcare promises, is that I believe, and I could be wrong, but I have been told and I believe that the NHS England, NHS Scotland, various NHS departments make the decisions on where the money goes. Labour can give them the money, but at the end of the day, it is up to the NHS which parts get which money based on a whole variety of mechanisms inside the NHS. So if anybody was looking through the manifestos and getting annoyed that they did nowhere said that they would boost access to gender-related healthcare, that's mostly because they can't really. They can say to the NHS, we need you to do more of this, this, and this, and the NHS will do it. But then there's a whole other mechanism there. It's not something that a party could necessarily promise and then deliver on. All right, so because we are already running out of time in our new segment, let me do a quick fire round of other stuff that has come up. So, potential protections for LGBT venues. As Labour is saying that pubs are community hubs, but 18 are closing each week in Britain. Labour will list pubs as assets of community value, so community groups have the first chance to buy local pubs when they are under threat. That means that potentially if an LGBT space, which are closing all the time at ridiculous rates all over London especially at the moment, potentially that means more buy opportunities like they have done with the Royal Vauxhall Tavern. So that I think could be an actual good. Moving to the next thing, apparently Labour will work to eliminate institutional biases against BAME communities, including limiting stop and search. Obviously that sounds great. Make Ofcom better when safeguarding media ownership plurality. Again, that sounds great, especially with all the shit that is coming down from one or two specific multi-conglomerate corporations that are really shitting on trans people all the time. They also talked about enforcing recommendations from the Levinson inquiry, which would be pretty fucking great. They want to establish an inquiry into fake news. Again, something that would be really affect the reporting of trans issues in the UK. They've said that they want to invest in public services across the board. Obviously, trans people use public services all the time. This is a big one. They want to end universal credit, which, by the sounds of universal credit, has been an absolute fucking nightmare for everyone concerned. Lots of trans people are on benefits for various reasons, so this one could have a major impact on trans people's lives. And they also have talked about putting in proportional representation, which would change how elections are done. So basically, Parliament will look more like how the country voted rather than it is now, where it's kind of some weird mix of, I don't know, it's kind of like in some places it can be like America, where in American elections where more people vote for a party, but then they don't get the representation in Parliament that they would like.
Yeah, it's first past the post. It's whoever reaches a particular number first, essentially, and it's not very representative. Carry on.
And finally, the Brexit roundup. Labour's plan is to negotiate a new Labour deal, not new Labour, a new deal with Labour values for workers' rights and equality and all this other stuff, and then send it out in a referendum. And I don't want to make a point about, like, you know, how Labour's Brexit policy is the best one, but there's been a common thing being said that it is completely incomprehensible and completely, like, impossibly hard to understand. But I just explained it in a sentence.
Indeed.
And you know me, Ashleigh, I use 100 words where 10 would do.
Indeed. You just did that several times. I like, you know, just the last kind of thing I'll say about Labour is before we move on. It's like, I kind of get why the pubs thing is in there, but also, given that the LGBT community has already got kind of higher rates of substance abuse and alcohol problems and so on, I really don't think that saying a pub is a community hub and deserves to stay, it's like, that's kind of irresponsible, actually. And given that a pub is supposed to be regarded as a community hub, but honestly, it depends on the community and the pub, and if young people are allowed in there, and if an LGBT venue doesn't let people in who are under 18 because alcohol is drunk there, then that is not solving some of the problems that we're talking about in terms of LGBT youth not really having safe spaces to go to. But that's a very, very specific point, and I get why it's in there. I'm just a bit like, all right, yeah, fine. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, so after all of this, I decided to take some of this to some people who were in the room, as in when the manifesto was drawn up. Not in the room as in with the government necessarily, but they had limited input into how the manifesto turned out. So I spoke to two co-chairs from LGBT Labour. I spoke to Lewis Adlington Lee and Heather Peto about all of this, and you can hear me talking to them now. Lewis and Heather, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. So why should trans and non-binary people vote for Labour?
Well, I mean, Labour have got a long tradition of fighting for equalities, and it is going to push forward with Gender Recognition Act reform and various other aspects of healthcare in for treating transgender and non-binary people. So, I mean, basically Labour have got the track record, so you can trust us. We're the only party, apart from the Tories, that could form the next government. So, really, it's a no-brainer choice. Like Labour will be the people that actually introduce the Gender Recognition Act, reform the Gender Recognition Act, and yes, that's what I would say.
How much input did LGBT Labour as a whole have in the manifesto?
Sure. So, as National Secretary, I took the lead on this. We didn't have the sort of timeline that we might usually have with the Labour Party, because it's a snap election. So everything was quite rushed. But basically, what we did was develop a policy document with 5 sort of key areas based off of what our members had said through a consultation we ran through October, through what was good from the 2017 manifesto, and then from the sort of policy that we as an organisation have passed at our annual general meetings over the last couple of years. So we collated that and built a policy submission, which we then shared with Dawn Butler, the stakeholder and policy teams at the Labour Party, and we sent it around to sort of what you would see as all the key stakeholders, so the NEC, the entire shadow cabinet, and all the general secretaries of the affiliated trade unions. So that's the level of input that we had. We didn't have any kind of sort of formal sign-off process, because we are effectively an external organisation, so we're an affiliate to the Labour Party as a socialist society. But we did try and influence to get the policies that we saw as most important within the manifesto.
Were you successful in that?
Somewhat.
I think the thing is, we have to accept that this manifesto is rushed. Some of the language is clumsy because we didn't get the feedback like you would normally expect to have some of the feedback from the process, so that we'd be able to check the wording and be able to expand on sections that don't necessarily make sense or are incomplete. And there was lots of other aspects that we wanted to include in the manifesto. But again, as I say, sort of like manifesto is really just a concise document. And a lot of the other policies are starting to be announced, if you like, by people like Dawn Butler during interviews, etc., when she's quizzed on further details. So some of the things that we've been saying that we need more clarification on, like the non-binary issue, which I know you're going to come to later.
Let me come to that now, because the big thing that struck out to me in the manifesto was non-binary people weren't mentioned at all in it. And in response to the criticism from the trans and non-binary communities in regards to the manifesto, Secretary of State Dawn Butler released a letter she wrote to Penny Mordaunt a year ago, calling for non-binary inclusion in the government and in all of its forms, but this never made it into the manifesto. Is it because the manifesto was rushed? Is that why it was missed?
I believe so. I mean, I think when it said about reforming the Gender Recognition Act to introduce self-declaration for transgender people, that should have been, someone's missed out the non-binary in addition to that. And what Dawn Butler said last night very clearly was that all the laws are going to be reviewed by our Social Justice Commission.
Just to sort of build on that, so what we had in the manifesto that we'd submitted, so it included GRA reform, PrEP rollout, funding for sexual health services, funding for schools to deliver inclusive education, measures on LGBT plus homelessness, global envoy on LGBT plus rights. So they were things that we suggested that made it into the manifesto. And we are clear, we are disappointed that a lot of what we submitted didn't get in. But we're not going to stop campaigning to get those things pushed through and to be part of the next Labour manifesto, or to be delivered if we win on the 13th of December. So that includes things like proper funding for IVF treatment, making like anti-LGBT plus hate crimes an aggravated offence, outlawing conversion therapy, and then also what you were talking about around like the legal recognition of non-binary gender identities, and then also things like the way in which the Home Office treats LGBT plus asylum seekers. So those are the sort of areas that, and there are many more than that, including things like the spousal veto when it comes to same-sex marriage, that didn't make it into the manifesto. and we are disappointed that they're not in the manifesto. But I think Heather is right in terms of the manifesto shouldn't be seen as a limited document as to what a Labour government would only do. But also, like, it was a rush process, and unfortunately we weren't able to have as much input as we would have liked. But yeah, we're by no means, and Dawn has been very clear on this as well, Dawn Butler, that we're going to keep campaigning to get these issues addressed.
So you saw the response to Labour's pledge that they will make sure single-sex exemptions in the Equality Act will be understood and enforced. This was seen as a dog whistle to turn anti-trans people across the community, seemingly across party lines especially. What does this actually mean, do you think, when they wrote that down? Should trans and non-binary people be worried about Labour rolling back our rights?
No. Trans and non-binary people shouldn't be worried about Labour doing that. So LGBT plus Labour and Dawn Butler have both, in response to the valid concerns that have been raised, been very clear that a Labour government will reform the GRA and reform the Equality Act. We'll introduce self-declaration, and we will update the language in the Equality Act. That line that's included in the manifesto, we don't know why it's there. We don't think it should be there. Having sought clarification, we've got that statement from Dawn, and we put out our statement with our understanding on Labour's continued position of support for reform of the Gender Recognition Act. The law doesn't obviously, so the law doesn't differentiate between gender and sex. Labour would stick to its commitment that we had in 2017, that we're carrying forward, reforming GRA immediately, and that's been something that Dawn has been very clear on, and she's recently criticised in the House the Conservative government for their woeful sort of timelines around GRA reform and the fact that they're kicking it into the long grass. But yeah, so we don't think that clarification should have been in the manifesto because it's not changing anything. And so we completely understand why people's concerns are there. But
why do you think it was included? Do you think that this was, in a way, Labour's attempt to try and pacify certain elements of the party that may not be entirely down with Gender Recognition Act reform? Or do you think there's some other reason?
I don't know. I think I wouldn't want to speculate to suggest that there's like a hidden agenda, or that people are trying to appease certain elements. But I think the fact that it's in there is a mistake, and I hope that Labour have learnt from that and that they can see the quite legitimate concern and worry that has been caused by including this. I don't know what conversations went on in the Clause 5 meeting for that to be for that line to be included, and I don't know where it comes from. That's not a clarification that LGBT plus Labour have, unfortunately. So I can't give you like an actual, like I don't want to say that I think it's this and this because I don't know, and I haven't got a clear answer on what the reason was for putting it in.
Yes, I mean I think it was poorly written, and I think I suspect, and obviously we have no idea how this got in the first place. But I suspect what Dawn Butler is saying is actually what this actually originally meant, which is that trans women are women and they are entitled to use single-sex spaces for women, and the same with trans men. And I suspect that was written, just as a clarification, and somehow it's got in with some really a silly extra line with "this will be rigorously enforced" or whatever the actual line is. And you can take it either way, but I'm pretty sure that actually the intention behind it was just to make sure that people realise that transgender women and transgender men could use the single-sex services that they identify with. So, yeah, basically that's what I would assume that it is the actual thing. Like everything, not having a transgender person there at the Clause 5 meeting where the manifesto is read and is agreed upon, it does cause problems. And this is one of the reasons why all political parties need to get transgender people into Parliament, but also into the committees that control the parties, so that these sorts of mistakes don't happen, or this type of language that could be interpreted by campaigners to actually sort of be saying, the Labour Party's dog whistling to the anti-trans community. It is a problem with underrepresentation at high levels of the Labour Party, but all political parties.
Fair enough. Well, Heather, Lewis, thank you very, very much for chatting to me.
Thank you for having us on.
Yes, thank you.
Moving on from the party in red to the one in yellow, the Liberal Democrats. Now, it's worth pointing out that I myself, for many years, was a staunch voter for the Liberal Democrats up until the coalition, and I've never voted for them since. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are in precisely that camp, so I was interested specifically to see what the Lib Dem manifesto was saying and who it was trying to appeal to. So, Michelle.
All right, well, the most important thing to get into is basically at the top of every single chapter of their manifesto is basically some kind of variant to stop Brexit. This will help in this area. So the Lib Dems clearly putting all of their eggs into the we're going to stop Brexit basket. One of the more important things that they put in regards to trans people is that they want GRA reform. They said self-ID, including non-binary identities. Really good to see them say that. They have specifically said that they want to remove the spousal veto, something that Labour did not do. They said, in the last interview, they said that they didn't include a lot of the stuff because it was rushed. I mean, how long have people known there's going to be an election coming? You know what I mean? I'm not expecting them to have a word-for-word manifesto and a draw somewhere, but I would have thought they would have the outline somewhere. But anyway, that's by the by.
Yes, indeed.
So anyway, back to the Lib Dems. So they want to bring in self-ID. They want to bring that in for non-binary identities as well, which sounds pretty great. They have explicitly said that they want to bring in passports with an X gender marker. That's an objectively good thing to put in for non-binary people. They want to defend the Human Rights Act, which is something that Labour also want to do, as it seems to be like every single Conservative at some point has said that they want to scrap the Human Rights Act because are they cartoon villains? I think so. Also, when it comes to the NHS, they have promised a lot more money, not as much as Labour, but a lot, and they want to revolutionise mental health services, which is always good. They want to bring in a maximum waiting time standards, which, as someone who is currently on a 2-year waiting list for a certain mental health thing that I may go into in a later episode, that's good to hear. They also want to increase access to talking therapies. They want to make mental health truly on par with physical health, and they want to make it a requirement that a fair proportion, that's their quote, of all public funding for health research goes into mental health research, including for people with different needs, including the BAME communities and the LGBT plus communities, and the crossover where it is. They also want to bring in PrEP as fully available on the NHS, which is good. They don't want to scrap universal credit, but they want to reform it because they seem to like the idea that universal credit would mean an easier way back into work, which in theory doesn't sound so bad. But universal credit, being across the board thought of as a terrible idea. Mm-hmm. But the Liberal Democrats did say they want to bring down the initial wait from 5 weeks down to 5 days for the first payment. So, that's something. They also want to extend the Equality Act to all large companies with 250 plus employees, forcing them to monitor and publish data on gender, BAME, and LGBT plus employment levels and pay gaps, which sounds great. Mm. But the overall thing I got from the Liberal Democrat manifesto is they really, really want to stop Brexit. That's kind of the tentpole of their whole thing.
Yeah, which in fairness, if
you're going to make a stand on something, that's the thing to make a stand on right now, that and climate change.
Well, and it's, not an isolated problem, is it, I think? Because if Brexit's not stopped and the hard right gets command of the country, then we're just going to kind of make everything worse in terms of emissions and stuff, because they'll go all Trump administration and say, oh no, we don't have to do that, we're incredibly exceptional and climate change is a hoax invented by whoever. Anyway,
yeah.
But I see why they've done that. They are trying, they are the party of Remain. But then, Joe Swinson also said in an interview that they would in fact consider going into coalition with the Tories. but would not consider doing the same with Labour, which again is like, you have no idea how much you've just shot yourself in the foot by saying that. In addition to, obviously, the MPs who crossed the floor from the Conservative Party to the Lib Dems quite recently, some of whom, one of whom triggered the resignation of the entire LGBT Lib Dem group. As I recall, Philip Lee, who has previously been kind of homophobic and various other things, it kind of seems like the Lib Dems, they still seem kind of like sellouts, essentially. And so it does make you think, well, if you vote to stop Brexit and then they go into coalition with the Tories and we end up with a hard Brexit, that's defeating the object of your entire tent pole, surely.
Yeah, I think that this is a big thing that's going to be resonating with a lot of the listeners out there, where it's like the Liberal Democrats have gone into coalition with the enemy before. That is a thing that is very much clouded over the Lib Dem vote for me, because I have voted for Lib Dems in the past, and I used to vote for them when they were at one point the most left-wing party, the most left-wing mainstream party. Back in the days of New Labour, where they were very close to the Tories, and I genuinely grew up with that, not knowing about Labour in the 70s. Just like, oh, Liberal Democrats, they're the left-wing party, I'm going to go with them, because that was what I thought they were, and they were at the time, but now that is not the case. Now they have gone more to the centre, I would argue to their detriment. So to get to the bottom of these concerns that I know have been floating around the trans community for many, many years since they went into coalition with the Conservatives, I spoke to Jasmine Josephine, who was, up until recently, the parliamentary candidate for Caerphilly in Wales. But she stepped aside for very, very interesting reasons that I will let her explain. Hello, Jasmine Josephine. Thank you very much for talking to me today. How's it going?
It's going well, thanks. And thank you for inviting me on.
Not a problem, not a problem. So, you were, up until recently, a candidate for the Lib Dems in Caerphilly. Why do you think trans and non-binary people should vote Lib Dems?
The simplest answer to that is, I think as one of the large UK national parties, we probably have, no, in fact, we definitely have the best policies for trans and non-binary people, for all trans people, in fact. When you look at the manifestos, almost all of which are out now, you look at what the Conservatives are doing around trans issues and trans rights, and when they aren't actively ducking the issue, the stuff they're coming up with does not sound good. When you've got Liz Truss coming out with Ministry of Freedom, I start worrying. You've got Labour, and of course the whole debacle over turf dog whistles turning up. That's not good, and as far as I'm aware, there's still no clarity there. And today the SNP's manifestos come out, and there are no major commitments to trans rights at all in there. At least I haven't been able to find any. And when you consider how they've acted as the Scottish government, I'm deeply worried about that. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to come here and say that the Liberal Democrat policies are perfect. I think we can still do a lot better in terms of minor recognitions for minors 16 and under. But certainly we've got the basis for a really good start.
So yeah, the Liberal Democrats have put a lot of pledges in their manifesto that do sound pretty great. With the Liberal Democrats having in the past gone into coalition with the Conservatives, who are arguably the biggest threat to trans and non-binary people right now, in your eyes, could a vote for the Liberal Democrats result in a Conservative government?
Was the Conservative government made up as it currently is? No. They are far too hard right. I should say, I'm not going to try and explain away what the Liberal Democrats did when we were in coalition with the Conservatives. There's a lot of things we did then that I personally just don't agree with, but that's my personal politics. But I think a distinction has to be drawn between the Cameron Conservative government, which was fairly centre-right, and a Johnson government, which has lurched so far towards the hard right that we're actually comparing what is now essentially two different parties. There's the Conservative Party of old, the Conservative Party of 2010, which completed the process of making sure that the Equality Act was mostly enacted, that the relevant provisions were enacted. And we're talking about a coalition government that ensured that same-sex marriage was put through, that we had the Women's Inequalities Committee report into looking at reforming the Equality Act around the protected characteristics of gender reassignment and sex to merge them into the protected characteristic of gender identity, which is a huge step and would have paved the way to allow for non-binary identification. So I would say now to anybody who's worried about the Liberal Democrats going into a coalition with the Conservative government, look at what the Conservative government was like back then. Look at what it's like now. do you honestly think that the Liberal Democrats, who really are passionate about ensuring equal rights, would prop up a government that would tear people's rights away?
I think, based on my time talking to the transgender community, and I'm not going to lie, my own personal experience, the Liberal Democrats going into coalition with the Conservative government was seen as, in some respects, a betrayal. And I can definitely say from my own personal life that policies enacted when the Liberal Democrats were in power with the Conservatives have directly affected my own life in incredibly negative ways. What would you say to someone from my position who they don't necessarily see a distinction between you and the Conservatives, even now as the Conservatives go to the hard right?
Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, it's, as I said, I am not going to sit here and cheerlead what we did as a party in the coalition, or at least not huge swathes of it. There were definitely mistakes made. We gave up on policies that we should never have given up on, and we allowed policies from the Conservatives that we shouldn't have allowed. And this has caused a great deal of harm. There's certainly no question about that. And as a party, we have learnt from that. We needed, even before going into coalition, I think we needed to understand the lesson that you can't just say, oh, this is for the greater good, and then ignore the harm that may cause. And now as a party, I can say that we have learnt that lesson. It isn't possible to go, oh, this is for the greater good. You have to consider all the consequences. And more importantly, I think we can't be the party that says we're for the many. Because when you say we're for the many, what you're saying is all those people on the margins who we aren't covering and have never covered, well, tough, we still aren't going to cover you. And so I think, in fact, I know that as Liberal Democrats, we have improved immeasurably from where we were.
As someone who was up until very recently running for your seat in Caerphilly, why did you step down?
It was a difficult decision. I'll have to be honest. And actually, although it was a difficult decision, it wasn't a decision that needed a huge amount of time. Because for me, it came down to three things. The first one, obviously, is stopping Brexit. Stopping Brexit is vitally important. The harm that Brexit has already caused to this country cannot be understated, and I don't think it is yet to be calculated. And I'm not talking economic harm. I am talking about harm to the social fabric of our society. And if Brexit is allowed to continue, and let's make no mistake on this, if the withdrawal agreement passes, that's not an end to Brexit. That is the start of Brexit. So if Brexit is allowed to continue, the harm that it will continue to cause will just grow and grow and grow. So stepping aside to increase the chance of the UK stopping Brexit was one very, very, very good reason. The second reason is that we cannot have a Johnson government in place with a majority government. Again, the harm that would cause to this country would be abominable. And this led directly on to my third one, which was specifically around trans rights and trans issues. I've been tracking my apologies, I've got people binging at me all over the place. So I've been tracking the far right and hard right movements across the US, Australia and UK since about 2005. And they've always shown the same pattern of behaviour where a sort of moderately right party will start using far right and alt-right and hard right talking points to start courting a more extreme element of the vote because they're losing votes out of the middle. And they get the votes, but then they have to fulfill on their promises. So they move to the right. And now to get more votes, they get more extreme. So they say more and more, and on it goes, on it goes, and on it goes. So now we're at the situation where we have a Johnson government with a Minister for Women's and Equality saying she wants to scrap the role and the Ministry for Women's and Equalities. She wants to scrap the Government's Equality Office. She wants to replace it with the Ministry of Freedom. That's so bad. Sorry, even for the Tories who are desperate to rip up workplace protections and equality law, that is just... Sorry. I actually wrote this on the blog. I reckon the moment Liz Truss said that, Orwell started spinning in his grave, chanting, "My works were not a warning. They were a warning. They were not a blueprint for what the future is meant to look like." But yes, so that's just within women's inequalities.
That's definitely the reason why we haven't bothered to try and talk to any Conservatives. Yeah. And that's the only standard of podcast we've made. It's like no Tories, no Brexit Party, no DUP, for the obvious reasons that they are fucking awful. But anyway, so you paint a picture there that is very compelling and sounds like an absolute nightmare for trans and non-binary people. Are you confident that if the Democrats were to go into a coalition, that they would be able to keep the pledges that they have made to the trans community and protect current protections?
Yes. At the very minimum, we would be keeping current protections. There is no way the Liberal Democrats could remain in a coalition government with the Conservatives when the Conservatives start stripping equality legislation and protections away from people. And that's for any group covered by the Equality Act, which is in fact everybody. Everybody's covered by the Equality Act. So if the Conservatives started making moves to try and strip away equality rights and equality legislation for anybody, I would know that the Lib Dems would walk away from that coalition and bring the government down. And certainly this would definitely apply for trans people as much as it would apply for anybody else. At the end of the day, is stopping Brexit important? Yes. Is it more important than throwing marginalised communities to the wolves? No. But then as Lib Dems, we've also got to ask ourselves the question, what happens if we fail? What happens if, despite our best efforts, Brexit still happens? What are we as a party? We are the party that will take us back into the EU. Because for us, there is a finite point at which the cost of stopping Brexit becomes too great. If the Liberal Democrats start selling out marginalised communities, what happens to those members in the party? We walk. And if you don't have members, you don't have a party. It really is that simple.
Fair enough. Jasmine Josephine, thank you very much for talking to me.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me on.
Okay, so that was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. After talking to her, I realised that there were so many other things that I probably should have asked. For example, the fact that homophobes have been welcomed into the party with open arms from the Conservative Party. Much chagrin in the party itself. So apologies for that, listeners. I fucked up there. I should have asked that, and I didn't. But what I did ask, I think she gave a pretty good answer for, in that the Liberal Democrats aren't likely to throw minorities under the bus, because otherwise that may be the final straw for a lot of their members. And something that didn't get into the interview because I had to make some cuts for time, but I wanted to especially mention here, is that she pointed me in the direction of the Lib Dem Constitution, which basically said that it's written in their constitution that they cannot essentially screw over and sell out minorities. And if you look back at the time in coalition, you can argue that they definitely, absolutely screwed minorities, but not in a direct way, if you see what I mean.
I'm not sure about that as the strength of an argument, but I do see what you're saying, and she said herself in the interview, didn't she, that lessons have been learned, and I really, really hope so. I would genuinely like to see a fully left-wing Liberal Democrat Party becoming a stronger force in British politics, perhaps to the detriment of the Conservative Party, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think there's a strain of kind of neoliberalism which is running through the Liberal Democrats, which a lot of people who are now leaning more towards the unambiguous left are rejecting, and foreseeing the same problems with the Lib Dems that we had within the coalition government, where they, negotiated for, we're going to get better rates on student loans after backsliding on, saying that those should be reduced. And we got that, in return for tightening benefit sanctions. And it's like, you're not fighting you're not the goodies here, you're not the good guys here. But
no, and I have talked for many, many hours on this podcast about how the particular government from 2010 to current day, has specifically impacted my life in horrific ways that have left me quite hurt, at the least hurt, at the most absolutely raging. But what I will say is that I really, really liked Jasmine Josephine. I think that she has her head screwed on. I think she genuinely cares about the trans community in a way that only a trans politician really could. And at first I was really disappointed that she wasn't running in Caerphilly, because I want as many trans people running in every seat. I want trans people running in every seat. I want trans parliament, damn it. I want trans MPs. I want to be lousy for trans MPs is what I would say. But she made a good point. She wants to stop the Tories at any cost, even at a personal cost to her, it could be seen.
Indeed.
So I may not agree with her party's past, and I may not agree with some of the things that her party has been doing lately in regards to homophobes coming in from the Conservative Party, but I like her.
Yeah.
And I did walk away from it feeling a lot better about the Liberal Democrats in general, knowing that she is in it. And she's not alone, because they've got Helen Belcher, who's running in Chippenham, who is, I think, the first trans woman to run for a seat in Parliament that actually has a decent chance of winning. And we're going to have her on the show next week to talk about what it's like to be on the campaign trail as a trans woman, but that's for next week. Anyway.
So, Michelle, in a sense, kind of got the easy job, or the difficult one, because she had to write a lot of stuff down. Because I looked at a couple of manifestos, and it turned out I didn't actually have to write anything down, because the parties themselves haven't made any specific promises, or indeed, in some cases, even mentioned the fact that trans people exist and are part of the community in the UK. And so, I think, loath as I am to talk about them once again, but I've read the Tory party manifesto. I've got to be honest, it's a fairly shocking document. There are parts of it which are proto-genocidal, essentially, where it's saying, we're going to make traveller communities and traveller encampments, we're going to make those completely illegal. Anybody that does those will be fined or imprisoned or whatever.
You're kidding.
And that's like, no.
Are you fucking serious? No, I knew that the Labour and Lib Dem manifestos would be more work, because they were around 100 pages each.
Yes.
But I sort of thought, if I read the Tory manifesto, I'm going to lose the deposit on my flat, because I'm going to punch so many holes in the walls of my flat. It would not be worth it. So I figured my rage against the Tories comes from a very deep and emotional place. Your rage from the Tory comes from an also deep and emotional place, but also a logical place. So I figured you were the best person to take it. So that is why I have not read the Conservative manifesto.
Yes, and I regret doing so. It's surprisingly short compared to the Labour one, which, as you say, is 100 pages. And in the same way that the Lib Dem manifesto seemed to rely on stop Brexit, one of the key messages in the Tory manifesto is get Brexit done. Now, that seems to be trucking along with the line that we've come to expect from the Johnson government, which is get Brexit done at any cost, even if it causes medicine shortages and food shortages and crashes the economy and everything else. That's a running thread throughout all of it. So obviously there's that about the traveller communities, which does not specifically relate to the trans community, although I imagine, again, there's going to be an intersection of those two things.
No, but they want to make a culture that has been around for maybe like a couple of thousand years completely illegal, right?
Completely illegal, make it disappear, etc. Which is, you see what I mean when I say that's kind of genocidal, trying to suppress an entire way of life, an entire culture, an entire community is defined by the UN using that word. However, on the stuff which is definitely staying in my lane, was quite light on the ground. There was nothing in the manifesto about GRA reform. There was nothing in the manifesto about trans healthcare, of course. I mean, why would there be? There was not a great deal in the manifesto which gives you very much faith that the NHS will be protected as the institution that it is. And the manifesto from the Conservative Party also contains a number of claims which were easily demonstrated to be false, more or less the day the manifesto was published. So one of them was that there would be 50,000 new nurses, and this was so dishonest that noted investigative journalist Piers fucking Morgan took them to task over this claim, because it includes 19,000 people who are already nurses. So straight away that number of 50,000 is it's a fiction. It's also worth pointing out that Liz Truss, who is the current Women and Equalities Minister, has gone on record as saying a couple of months ago that she thinks that the chair and the Women and Equalities post should not exist and should instead be replaced by the Ministry of Freedom, which is about as dog whistly as you can get. And, well, as our Lib Dem candidate pointed out, that George Orwell would have some pretty strong and, I'm guessing, fairly angry words to have to say about that. So, all in all, I was reading through the Conservative Manifesto with a mounting sense of dread and, oh my God, we cannot possibly allow these people another run at the helm of the government. Because, I mean, was it full of stuff like, oh, we're going to bring back law and order, we're going to chase all of these horrible people? So there's lots of stuff about crime and punishment, lots of fairly ill thought out stuff in that sense. Again, they're making a false claim by saying that, oh, well, we're going to increase the numbers of police. And it's like, well, if you hadn't cut 20,000 police officers a few years ago, then we wouldn't be having this literal problem that you're now pretending you care so much about. So basically, I'm not going to spend too long on this, because if I wanted to spend time really taking the Tories apart, we would be here for several weeks. But there is no conceivable turn of events, there is no conceivable alternate universe where, as a trans person here in the UK at the moment, voting for this iteration of the Tory party is a good idea. There is no universe where that makes sense. It just, everything that they say, everything that they do, the people who are involved, the things that they say, the things that they do, are just so reprehensible. I don't understand how anybody in the trans community or in the LGBT community, or indeed anybody anywhere, could possibly think that these people have got a grasp on it more than another political party. To say that the Tories, they're the party of, sound fiscal good sense, and it's like, well, clearly they're not. Austerity hasn't worked. People have died for nothing. So please don't vote for the Tories.
Well, actually, in defence of the Tories...
that's something I never thought I would hear you say.
I just wanted to hear your reaction. I got nothing to defend the Tories. I just wanted to see if you would believe me.
I mean, honestly, I was going to crawl down the Skype electronical wire to your head and slap you about the face. Up next, the Scottish National Party. Now, neither me nor Michelle could vote for the SNP because they haven't fielded any candidates in England. And that's fairly obvious why that hasn't been done. They are the Scottish National Party. Now, but I wanted to flag this up for a couple of reasons. Despite talking about quite a lot of trans and wider LGBT community issues in the manifesto for 2017, all of this seems to have mysteriously disappeared for this iteration of their manifesto. It's known and has been reported several times that Nicola Sturgeon has faced some dissent within the SNP for her support of trans rights. This dissent has included something that we didn't cover last time because the news hadn't emerged, including an anti-trans free speech protecting women style event which was planned to be held at Holyrood on the same day as Trans Day of Remembrance on 20th of November.
I mean, Jesus Christ.
So, yeah, exactly. It's actually been postponed until the new year. It's not clear whether the people who organised it actually were aware of the significance of the date, although given their things that they do... Pretty sure they did.
Anyone who has ever taken a look at trans stuff knows what Trans Day of Remembrance is about.
It's pretty much the first thing they teach you about at trans college, isn't it? Anyway, it's worth saying that the event didn't take place on the 20th. It's been postponed until the new year. The idea is that this event will also feature Sheila Jeffreys, who was the author of Gender Hurts, which is, from our perspective, not a good book. But she's also suggested that trans women are parasitically inhabiting women's bodies. So we're parasites. Isn't that nice? But this event... It's worth pointing out that this event was organised by one of the SNP members of the Scottish Parliament, Joan McAlpine, as well as a Scottish Labour MSP, Jenny Mara. It's a little bit disconcerting that the SNP have kind of decided to drop trans rights as something to campaign on during the election cycle. It was there in the 2017 manifesto, and it's not in the 2019 manifesto. That's possibly slightly concerning. And it's quite easy to see that, well, that's because there's been this backlash, but then, you kind of hoped there'd be some standing firm on certain issues. You kind of hope that this discord within the SNP about this would have been kind of shown for the petty, turfy horse trading that it evidently is. But as Pink News actually pointed out, there's more words about fish and fishing and trade and so on. There's more words about fish in the SNP's manifesto than there is about the LGBT community.
And fishing is a big deal in Scotland.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm not saying it's not important.
But I
it's
think
just
there's probably more LGBT people in Scotland than there are people that work in the fishing industry. It's like, 10% of people are LGBT in some way? I don't think 10% of the Scottish population are working in fish.
I mean, I genuinely don't know. And obviously, if you do feel the need to get in touch to correct us about that little factoid that we've largely just made up, then please do so nicely. We are trying our best. But the point, or one of the points, is that there were several things, not just related to, trans rights and GRA reform and so on, that were about more wider LGBT issues, which were in the 2017 manifesto, which have been dropped for this one. So that's a concern, potentially. So for our Scottish listeners, it's a hard choice. And finally, an honourable mention to the Brexit Party, which... no, we didn't bother reading that one either, because why the fuck would we?
I actually did read this one, because it was very simple to read. I didn't know I was reading their manifesto until I'd read it. They've actually called it a contract with the people.
Right, okay. That's
and
terrifying.
The basic thing is, from all this magic money a no-deal Brexit is going to give us, we are going to put more money into the NHS. That's essentially the Brexit Party thing.
But then, wasn't that one of the central claims for the Leave campaign, and that was shown to be fraudulent? That we send the EU 350 million a week, let's spend it on the NHS, and so that money hasn't materialised. Of course,
they've got around that because they've said that they are going to cancel a bunch of, in their words, wasteful projects like the big, I think it's HS2, the big motorway they want to build in between Birmingham and London, and
it's rail. HS2 is rail.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
See, we don't know transport. If you want to know about transport stuff, you better read the manifestos yourself. But anyway, they want to cancel a bunch of government projects and use that money to put into the NHS. And also, they're calling it the Brexit dividend. So they found a way to keep that phrase alive while sort of backdooring it so they don't break Electoral Commission rules.
Got you. So do you believe them?
Well, no, and I don't. To call the Brexit Party a political party is, in a way, a lie, because they aren't a party; they're a business.
Yeah.
And Nigel Farage is their CEO. They don't have any democratic anythings in the makeup of their party. You don't get to elect the leader. You don't get to vote on policy like you do with some parties. You don't have any input on who stands. Even if you do stand, you don't know if you're actually going to stand or Nigel Farage is going to bench you and then keep the money you put down for the deposit. Like, it's the Nigel Farage show, and Nigel Farage has proven himself to be a racist, ultra capitalist nightmare.
It's like a vanity project, isn't it? And I hope it goes the way of so many vanity projects. Like where the lead singer leaves the band and says, I'm going to go and have my own successful solo career, and then it just sinks without a trace. That's what I'm hoping for with the Brexit Party. But fingers crossed.
Yeah, the scary thing is that they haven't announced any other policies, really, apart from those very few things. So you could totally... I know they're not going to get a majority because they've stood down their candidates in Conservative seats because they really want Brexit, obviously. But the scary thing is people are so willing to vote for them even though they don't know what the hell they're going to do when they get there, really. Yeah,
well, I mean, in much the same way that the Vote Leave... the way the referendum went, in any case, clearly the people that were in charge of Vote Leave were just intending to make it a protest vote and didn't actually expect or particularly want to win, but they did, and now they have to make the best of their own stupid lies.
Yeah.
So, that more or less concludes our whistle-stop tour through the manifestos. However...
Oh, is that me?
No, I just wanted to see how long I could hold on that for, just for a sense of drama, We were lucky enough, or Michelle was lucky enough, a little bit earlier on, to speak to kind of a bit of a legend of the trans community, Christine Burns, which was a very interesting conversation, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you know what? I'm not going to say any more on that. I'm going to let her speak for herself. Here is the tape.
Christine Burns, thank you so much for making the time for us today. So, what's your take on the manifestos released so far?
Oh, goodness. I haven't really studied them that much, and that's probably because I don't really rate manifestos as being that important in terms of the progress we need to make. If you think back to the 2002 election, for instance, there's no mention of a Gender Recognition Act in anybody's manifesto. But of course, 2 years later, we had forced the government's hand into bringing forward legislation quite rapidly, really, and then debating it in Parliament. So the only advantage you have from having policy in a manifesto is that by convention, the House of Lords agrees to not vote down a measure, whereas if it's something that's arisen during a parliamentary term, then the House of Lords is quite entitled to kick out an act of Parliament or regulations that it doesn't like. The other thing I'd say, though, is, well, two things. One, of course, is that manifestos aren't written by the experts in a topic. So, and this is what I think you see in the controversy that's sprung up around the Labour manifesto, where they've used words which they probably don't understand the political significance of.
So on the subject of Labour's manifesto in regards to trans and non-binary policy, are you concerned?
And you see, this is what happens because it becomes a political thing. Well, the notable thing about when we introduced the Gender Recognition Bill in 2004 was that it actually had bipartisan support. Nobody was whipped in the passage of the Gender Recognition Act. It was a conscience vote, and it was won by, well, it was overwhelmingly, I think it was 346 to about 40 something. I can go and look up the numbers, but yeah, that was purely MPs voting according to their conscience, because most of them had actually met a trans person in their surgeries. That was one of the things that we constantly got people to do over the years that we were campaigning, so that people actually understood in very human terms who and what a trans person was. The only people who really voted against it were the DUP, which is to be expected, and people aligned with the Christian Institute and the Evangelical Alliance, who decided to make this a cause célèbre for themselves, and they sponsored particular MPs to be the opposition to the bill. But otherwise, there was very little opposition. I mean, partly because the technicalities people didn't really understand anyway. They were just voting on the fact that the government had lost this issue in the European Court of Human Rights. They'd met lots of nice and articulate trans people who had explained that this stuff was important. And it was, as I say, because it wasn't partisan, it was non-contentious. Yeah, let's vote for it.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a completely different world now compared to then.
It is. And I think, I mean, I can actually turn this around and say I blame the Conservative manifesto in 2017 for the backlash that we've got now. Because, certainly there was a build-up of an anti-trans sentiment. You can spot it in the press from the beginning of 2016. But there wasn't really a hook to hang it on until Theresa May almost arbitrarily decided to pop into the Conservative manifesto for her snap election, GRA reform, without explanation for anybody, and really then created a vacuum because it was in there, nobody talked about it, and therefore it was open for anti-trans sentiments to define what it meant, and particularly to define this idea about self-identification, which is the worst choice of words I think anybody politically could ever have come up with.
So, in your opinion, which party would you trust with giving the trans community what it needs?
Oh my God, this is down actually to fundamentally to which parties I trust anymore. And it's a sad comment on the status of our politics that it's really difficult to do that at the moment. We can write off the Tories, although they were actually really helpful in passing the 2004 Act. And beyond the images as the nasty party, they were actually a lot of very decent people involved. I think that the only reason that the Tories have got involved in Gender Recognition Act reform has been for reasons other than the interests of trans people. And they're blatant opportunists, and they've shown themselves to be liars. So I wouldn't put any trust in them these days, sad to say, because I think they, historically, on this at least, they actually they played fair and were genuinely concerned to try and get it as right as was politically possible in 2004. Labour, instinctively, you think, well, the politics says they ought to be in favour of socially progressive policies, so they ought to be trans people's friends. By and large, they've tried to be, but they have got a problem in their ranks, and they have to deal with that problem, I think, before it's easy to trust them again. It pains me. I would just like to be able to instinctively say, Labour, fantastic. Liberal Democrats, on the face of it, actually, they've got the most credentials in this department, quite apart from the fact that they were involved in the most recent piece of legislation, the marriage equality legislation, and was it 2012 under
2013? Yeah,
2013, yes. And they've been making all the right noises and supported, at least until recently, they've supported trans people in their ranks. One very important Liberal Democrat prospective parliamentary candidate in December 2019 is Helen, forgotten her name.
Helen Belcher.
Helen Belcher. Thank you. Sorry, Helen.
Oh, we can re-record it if you like.
No. It's all right. Let's stay with my. This is real me aging and losing my memories and my faculties. So I think they are most likely to do the right thing. But I think realistically, in spite of the dreams of Jo Swinson, I don't think they have a prospect of being certainly not forming a government. They might find themselves forming a coalition again, but then their history in terms of what they do when they form coalitions doesn't all go well.
Oh.
I think it depends where you live, and the real imperative now, I believe, on this occasion, regardless of what we individually want, and regardless of our normal affections for a particular party, is to look at the likelihood of who's going to get elected and try and ensure that that is somebody who is either going to give us a referendum on Brexit or to end the current nightmare. So, you want at all costs to avoid Conservatives or, heaven forbid, Brexit Party politicians getting into being elected in your constituency. After that, any result is better than most. So I think overall, I think people, unless they're in a very solid constituency, I think need to vote tactically with that goal, because much as we want particular policies, like improving the Gender Recognition Act, it doesn't matter a hoot if our country is economically crippled and we are descending fast into a dystopian nightmare with a heavily right-wing government. So the priority is the stability of our future, our country, over the things we would individually like to see normally when we're choosing to elect somebody.
Christine Burns, thank you very, very much for talking to me.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I thoroughly agree with Christine's assessment. I mean, she's a lot kinder to the Conservatives than I would be, but I think she's right.
Yes.
I think in this case, this is an election about, when it comes to the trans community, stopping the Conservatives and accepting the lesser of several evils. I mean, I'm not that against the idea of selecting the lesser of evils, because it is literally the lesser of a bunch of evils. You want the least evil option. We'd quite like there to be an option that is perfect, but let's be practical. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Indeed.
And Yeah, I think she's entirely right. I think this election, when it comes to the trans and non-binary communities, has to be about stopping the Conservatives. And how you choose to do that, listener out there, whichever party you back that isn't the Conservative Party, that's going to be your call. Me and Ashleigh can't tell you which way to go, and we don't really want you to. But we will tell you where not to go. That's the one thing we will do.
Yeah, I'm going to say, we have not been saying it directly, but we have been kind of, waggling our eyebrows and pointing suggestively at where we think you should go. But no, absolutely, it's not a decision that we can make for you. However, we feel genuinely that the priority for this election, and probably for most subsequent elections, is to stop the Conservatives.
But it's going to be fine. It's going to be fine. It's going to be fine.
It's going to be fine. And on that note, we will leave it to be fine until our next episode. As we mentioned, we have Helen Belcher on. We'll be looking a little bit more into some of this election fun and games in the run up to it. Until then,
if you like the cut of Christine Byrne's jib, you should check out the book that she put together, Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows. It is a story about the history of trans people. And she did say to me that the aim of the book is more to be read not necessarily by trans people, but by allies and cis people in general. So this would be an ideal Christmas present for that nan of yours who doesn't quite understand what the struggle for trans equality has been. So with Christmas coming up, I would highly recommend you give that a go. Check the link in the description. Check our link sheet. I will provide a link to places where you can buy it. Also, you'll be able to find all of the social media stuff for all of the people we talked to today, the LGBT Labour law. And you'll also be able to follow Jasmine Josephine on Twitter and all the other people. I'd highly recommend that you do. And if you like this show, then you should check out our social media, which is just as good. You should check us out on Twitter, @WhatTheTrans. You should check it out on Facebook, facebook.com/WhatTheTrans. And you should check us out on Tumblr, whatthetranspod.tumblr.com. Do all the sub-internet things. Do all those things.
Yes. Or the Dom internet things, whatever you like. But make sure you listen to the podcast. Keep yourself safe and have a lovely week. We will speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.